Okay. So I want to welcome everybody to this convening of the Political Concepts Group here at Brown. We are thrilled to be hosting this particular event and also thrilled to be members of the consortium of schools that have been hosting political concepts events over the past several years. For those of you who are new to the concept of political concepts, it is a consortium of 5 universities, including CUNY, NYU, the New School, Columbia, and Brown. And we've been thrilled to be included in recent years. I'm Amanda Anderson, the director of the Kogut Center, and I mostly just benefit from the extraordinary organizational and intellectual energies of the organizing group, which consists of Adi Ophir, Bonnie Honig, and Timothy Buse. So I want to thank the 3 of them for organizing this conference and previous conferences and for doing so much for the collaborative intellectual life at Brown. I also want to thank Etienne Balibar for agreeing to let us host this event. We're thrilled to be able to think together. Well, we're very, very grateful, and I don't know whose persuasive force was most determining, but I thank that person too. So we're very, very pleased to be able to think together with Etienne about his extremely important work, always timely, but more pressingly timely at the current moment. I also just want to announce that, first of all, many of you have probably seen, we have a Fordham University Press display, which has, in addition to Etienne's book, several recent books, some of them by people who are here at the conference or involved in political concepts. And I want to announce as well that there is a forthcoming book based on contributions to political concepts conferences, Political Concepts, a Critical Lexicon, forthcoming from Fordham in August of 2017, edited by Jay Bernstein, Adi Ophir, and Ann Stoller. So I just wanted to announce that and invite everybody to be on the alert for that next July. So I think that covers everything. Did I miss anything, Adi? Okay, I did miss one thing. I want to just thank everyone who was involved in making this event happen. I want to thank the Pembroke Center for always being such a wonderful neighbor to the Kogut Center in this fabulous building. And I also want to distinctly and strongly thank the Kogut Center staff, Kit Salisbury, who's in there organizing the croissants, and Traude Kastner, who is omnicompetent and absolutely wonderful. So with that, I think we'll get started with the first session. We'll have the 2 papers and then followed by a Q&A, for which I will keep a queue. So once we get to that point, just signal me if you would like to speak. Okay, so we'll start with Jacques Lezra of NYU, and the second paper will be Ellen Rooney from Brown University.
My concept is relation. If there is a concept of relation, then it has this peculiar feature. Relation serves to shape and regulate the field of politics, to shape and regulate the notion of the concept, and also to shape and regulate the relation between politics and concepts. You'll object that I'm being loose with my definitions. Quite rightly, you'll ask whether, when I affirm that the concept of relation serves to shape and regulate the field of politics, the notion of the concept, and the relation between politics and concepts, I'm using the expression serves to shape and regulate in the same way, since the expression's objects are so different. The object politics, or the political, that relation gives shapes to and regulates, the object concept that I claim is also given shape to by relation, and the object, and the object.
It's a persistent issue that people really need to eat the mic. No, talk very, very closely to the mic.
Okay.
And,
Hi, Mike.
And project.
All right. Let me begin again. No, I won't begin again. I won't subject you to this, but this is rather awkward. you want to know just how this shaping and regulating that I've been droning on about happens. You'll ask, and you'll be echoing an important debate to which I return in brief, you'll ask whether a relation, as it pertains to politics or the political concepts and their relation, etc., works internally or externally in each of those fields. You want to know why we should take account today in this dark hour of the concept relation. Is relation indeed a political concept? And if so, can it be of any use in thinking through, that is, in producing concepts suitable for the state of, or states of affairs that have led to Brexit, to the election of a neo-fascist regime in the United States, to the consolidation of ethnic politics in Europe? How does relation shape and regulate the field of politics, the notion of the concept and the relation between politics and concepts? To the first question, I'll offer a sort of affirmative answer. Yeah, it is a sort of political concept, relation is, which is a good thing, I suppose. To the second, to the question of the use in the current conjuncture of relation as a political concept, I'll answer that it is useless unless we attend to relations' provocative semantic discontinuities, that is, to its defectiveness as a concept. Not unless and until we settle on a notion of politics that's equally defective but adequate to relations' long and complicated history. Not, in short, if we remain committed to a classic understanding of the concept, of its origination, topology, and uses. And to the third question, I'll answer that relation shapes and regulates the field of politics, the notion of the concept and the relation between politics and concepts, when relation becomes a form of narrating or relating, and when it becomes a form of translating. No one writing today has done more to shift our understanding of relation, of politics, and of concepts than Etienne Balibar, to whose work this edition of the conference Political Concepts is devoted. Since 1993, when Balibar published La Philosophie de Marx, and with a different inflection since 2014, when the book's revised edition appeared, the term relation, a term whose adventures are fought primarily on the scholastic terrains of epistemology or logic, with occasional important sorties into anthropology and, of course, diplomacy, is definitively associated with Balibar's work and with his long-standing project to unsettle the various notions of politics to which Marx's work most often gets attached today. We know from La Philosophie de Marx that Marx's work provides an ontology of relations, an ontology that substitutes, in place of, now I cite Balibar, the discussion of the relations between the individual and the genus, a program of inquiry into the multiplicity of relations that exist between individuals by dint of their multiple interactions. This multiplicity of relations concerns, Balibar says, not what is ideally in each individual as a form or a substance, or what would serve from outside to classify that individual, but rather, he says, many transitions, transferences, or passages in which the bond of individuals to the community is formed and dissolved, and which in its turn constitutes them. Balibar's readers associate the concept of an ontology of relations with the term transindividuality, which Balibar elaborates from Gilbert Simondon's work. I'll have more to say about Balibar's notion of relation in a moment. For now, let me pick up on one aspect of his definition. Relations escape the definitional trap in which ontologies are generally caught, the conception of individual beings existing alongside other individuals to whom they may be related either on internal grounds, grounds intrinsic to their substance or to their definition, or external, accidentally related through propinquities or inessential circumstances, or through a concept external to the relata. An ontology of relations offers us a philosophy of the being of relations, understood neither as what is ideally in each individual, nor as what serves from outside to classify that individual. Relations, instead, are transitions, transferences, or passages. Imagine, Balibar asks us, that these transitions, transferences, or passages have a way of being that is distinct from the way of being of those individuals that they serve to relate. That relation is perhaps ontologically prior to the relata. Now imagine relation as first ontology. The paradox is profound. It would be like saying, and this will be one of my suggestions, that translation is prior to or has a mode of being distinct from and constitutive of whatever languages we translate from or to, just as for Balibar, transitions, transferences, or passages have a mode of being distinct from and perhaps prior to whatever individual positions these transitions, transferences, and passages serve to relate. What is at stake politically in this ontology of relations? The old Robinsonade that builds a social being on the accretion of individuals, that is, on a principle of addition, stands on the priority of individual over relation. Robinson Crusoe, then Friday, then their relation, master and servant. My language, then yours, then a translation from one to the other. Politics, and hence whatever it is that can be designated as political, for instance, political action or political concepts, pertains to the expressive animal we are when that animal first forms part of a necessary coupling, as when Aristotle famously says, necessity gives rise to the coupling between those who are unable to exist without one another. For instance, the union of female and male for the continuance of the species, and the union of natural ruler and natural subject for the sake of security. A sequence of, this is no longer Aristotle, a sequence of proportional relations leads from this minimum of relation, the necessary reproductive relation and the necessary relation of subjection for the purposes of safety, to the city and to the commonwealth. That minimum of relation is originary and definitive. What follows is the unfolding in relation to that originary necessary relation of the minimum of relation. The way this minimum of relation unfolds follows both necessary rules, the rules of thought that lead from part to whole, but would make the whole prior to the part, and contingent circumstances. For instance, the historical circumstances that lead one family, or in Crusoe's case, one solitary castaway, to associate with another under certain circumstances for protection from this or that concrete or imaginary threat, and these families or minimal pairs, in turn, to seek association with others and to draw up rules governing the administration of their different interests with a common project of the state or the city. That these two orders, the order of thought on which necessary relation necessarily unfolds and the contingent order of history are not identical does not keep us from seeking to relate them. We might, for instance, seek to bring the necessary unfolding of minimal relations into accord with the accidents of fortune by grounding human sovereignty in something we'd stipulate to be as universal as the necessity of reproduction, call it a generalized concept of reason, or call it natural law. But on Balibar's account of Marx, the story shifts, and rather perilously. For every form of relation comes into relation with others as the condition on which we have individuals. That what obtains as first ontology is a multiplicity of relations means that we will never be able to bring this multiplicity into accord or into the closure of a classical concept under the sovereignty of a guiding relation. No shaper shapes or regulates the multiplicity of relations. This isn't to say that all relations are equal or that no relation can serve for a moment to bring an evanescent, ephemeral order to a multiplicity of relations. It is to say that the necessity of this or that principle of order, of this or that guiding relation or hypothesis, of a relation that serves for now to shape and regulate the field of relations, that this necessity cannot be derived from or made to cover without exception the multiplicity of relations. It's just that it cannot last and cannot prevail on immanent grounds. An ontology of relations is incompatible with any form of aristocracy, including aristocracies which install empty operators at their heart, operators like the people, the multitude, the demos, the deplorables. But, where was I?
Be even better in German. Und trotzdem.
Okay, that. Take, on the other hand, this is, I'm still working, or at least trying to work, from Balibar's unsettling of the notion of relation as the unfolding of minimal relations in a kind of Aristotelian framework, take, on the other hand, the nicely scholastic question whether relations are supervenient modes of substance. Simondon and Whitehead argue that they are rather the a priori condition on which an individual can be thought as such, what we think with. It's tricky, even dangerous, to fall on one or the other side of this apparently arcane dilemma. If relations are modes of substance, then they can be divided critically from the indivisible individual that precedes them, logically if not chronologically. Their secondariness at this analytic level can be pressed into the service of institutions that administer relations inasmuch as they're secondary to the interests, needs, responsibilities of individuals. Here, understanding individuals not as a logical, but as a social term. Individuals are subjects, selves, persons, and so on. If, on the other hand, relation is the a priori condition for our thinking that what is individual, if individual substance is a mode of relation, then it itself, relation, cannot be thought, not as an indivisible object of thought, nor in relation to other objects of thought. We may have an intuition regarding relation, but as soon as our intuition rises to the level of thought, its object is no longer the a prioricity of relation. The unthinkability of relation at this analytic level can be pressed into the service of institutions that mystify the grounds on which they stand, cloaking them in tautology and in violence, reasserting as institutional principles, and as if in compensation, the principles of identity and non-contradiction threatened by the a prioricity of relation. Matters are like this because they're like this, or that's just the way things are, or make America great again. These are my little devices here. Perilous politics, indeed. Only connect. E.M. Forster's character, Margaret Schlegel, infamously exclaims to herself. To the narrator also. Only connect the prose and the passion, and both will be exalted, and human love will be seen at its height. Live in fragments no longer. Only connect, and the beast and the monk, robbed of the isolation that is life to either, will die. Forster cannot endorse his character's sentimental and finally catastrophic sermon, and yet Margaret's delirious exclamation, to which she hews with fatal and farcical results, becomes a topos of modernist studies. Polonius gaggling on about modernism, the touchstone of popular platitude, the first relation among relations. Only relate, or only translate, or rather, first relate, first translate, by which we would now mean live in fragments, in a multitude of relations, in a multitude of translations henceforth. Is this claim regarding the primacy of relation the color of modernism in the fabric of contemporary political philosophy? Does it too lead to catastrophe or farce? Not if we read Balibar carefully. The word relation comes into English and the Romance languages from the Latin relatio, which, as Lewis and Short tell readers of their standard Latin dictionary, means a carrying back, bringing back, throwing back, retorting. From the start, I have two quite contradictory intuitions about relation. First, that relation is not self-evidently a political concept. It's a term we might use to give shape to logical worlds, to epistemological puzzles that are prior to and more fundamental than political considerations. Furetière's Dictionnaire universel of 1684 calls relation, in this sense, en termes de logique, in terms of logic, one of those accidents of substance, the relation which is between two people, between two things that cannot be conceived, one without the other, and of which one supposes the other, supposé. Thus he says, there is a relation between the son and the father, between the master and the servant, between the I and the object. The relation between the son and the father, between the master and the servant, is given in the couple of terms alone. We would say that father and son and master and servant are correlative couples of terms. One term implies the other. No son without a father, no master without a servant. It's less clear immediately how the I and the object, or even sight and object, might be correlative terms, or how each might suppose the other. We're handed over by Furetière's analogy to two presupposed definitions of I, or sight, and of object. Think more explicitly still of the sense of the term relation that we find in Locke, and then of the list of examples we might derive from the essay. Published in 1689, Locke's work is Furetière's almost exactly contemporary. Relation, Locke writes, is the last sort of complex which consists in the consideration and comparing one idea with another. These compared ideas, Locke says, how remote soever they may be from sense or from any operations of our own minds, are yet only such as the understanding frames to itself by repeating and joining together ideas that it had either from objects of sense or from its own operations about them, so that those even large and abstract ideas are derived from sensation or reflection, being no other than what the mind, by the ordinary use of its own faculties, employed about ideas received from objects of sense or from the operations it observes in itself about them, may and does attain unto. Our examples of relation understood in this strong Lockean sense will be, for instance, succession, distance, causation, and magnitude. On Locke's account, the understanding frames relation to itself. The scene is solitary, even Cartesian. The objects of sense before me are objects for my sense. Atomic ideas present themselves to my thought similarly. No consideration of other minds is entailed. I negotiate nothing with you who are first, after all, an object for my senses in the way that this chair might be. This is the problem with having deictics in your stupid talk. You need to find something to point to. And not even with myself do I negotiate anything whatsoever. When I write an essay concerning human understanding, I take myself as the object of my thought or sight, and the appropriateness of taking myself as object of thought or sight is given in myself. It is, as Furetière's definition would allow us to say, a definitive accident of my substance. Between substance and accident, hardly a shadow falls. At most, I consider and compare my idea of myself before I perceive this or that object for my senses, and after. And from this consideration and comparison of myself before and after, I take myself to be, for my understanding, an idea in time, changing but furnished with an identity. My perception of myself changes me. The relation between this changed me and the I perceived is one of succession, perhaps even of causation. The claim in any case is metaphysical rather than historical. Whatever we call politics will or may supervene in the shape of my negotiation with you or with myself of the conflict of different ideas, but it will stand on this pre-political ground which I first form for and of myself as the first identity to which ideas and sense data can then be related. Politics as negotiation of difference is on this description, and to use Simondon's term, only the unfolding, the negotiation, the formalization and deformalization of inter-individual rather than trans-individual relations. That was one of my intuitions. But I have, simultaneous with my idea of this solitary scene, the intuition that relation is indeed a political concept, or that the idea leads to something other than the lonely scene of self-relation on which inter-individual relations unfold, or indeed that the idea of a relation may not just lead to, but stand on something other than my empty first identity with myself. What we have just heard Locke call the consideration and comparing of one idea with another involves minimally 4 parts, which might form a tight system. A judgment that I might make for someone, who might be myself, concerning this idea or sense datum, and that idea or sense datum. I say minimally, and I say that something tugs at the idea that my 4-part system is indeed so closed, so systematic. I find that something like a circle or like a sort of excess or compensation worries me here in this Lockean field. I find here that the idea of the undivided, if not indivisible, identity of every sense datum is at once given in the senses and intuited a priori. My intuition that relation is indeed something other than an indivisible idea remitting to a solitary ontology expresses my uneasiness with this circle. And just what is this uneasiness, this simultaneous and triple suspicion that the sense datum is not clearly or immediately or singularly given, that it is never, for all appearances, undivided, and that I, to whom the possibly not one sense datum or idea is possibly not only given, that this I, similarly but not identically, may possibly be other than clearly or immediately or singularly given. It may help if we turn at this point to a related usage of relation from the sphere of the law. In classical Latin, relatio, is the action of laying a matter before the Senate, or the action of referring a case back to the original magistrate. In its nominal sense, relatio is the motion so introduced. We relate, return, refer a matter to the magistrate. We tell him the story, the relation, once again. Furetière's dictionnaire offers this definition. Relation is said of a referral, the witnessing, témoignage of a public person. In every contract that is in proper shape, the judge says, oui, nous, à la relation notaire, avons fait apposer le sel du Châtelet à ces prisons. We have apposed to this relation of the notaries, have opposed the seal of Châtelet. By early modernity, a relation is also an account then, a report, often referring, as in French, and even as the specific Fremdwort relation in Germanic languages, to detailed narrative accounts of voyages or events. The New World, battles, explorers, voyages. The dictionnaire says that a relation is a rapport, a récit de quelque aventure. It's said particularly, it says, des aventures des voyageurs, the voyageurs' adventures, travel narratives, observations that they make of their voyages. The drift of relatio from the juridical frame to broader, sometimes fictional narrative frames, with the consequent loosening or shifting of the relation between relatio and forms of truth claiming, occurs differently and at different moments in European languages and nations in which the juridical regimes are hardly identical, where the standing of adventurers and of explorers' travels may have distinctly different relations to state, imperial, or colonial institutions, where a testimony or the claim of fact may take its probative value from quite different popular, ecclesiastical, or state institutions. When the eponymous protagonist of the anonymous 1554 Lazarillo de Tormes sets out his life for a nameless, perhaps juridical figure, a certain Vuestra Merced, Your Honor, Lázaro frames his tale as the response to a request that he write and relate, escriba y relate el caso muy por extenso, that he write the matter at length, as the first English translation of 1586 has it. We might better capture the legal sense of the Castilian relatar that's hidden cloudily in the English translation, write the matter, if we said that Lázaro has been asked to make a deposition regarding the matter or to testify regarding the matter, and that his story or testimony, his relación, cheekily stands on both the protocols of legal affirmation or testimony and of fiction. The relación has standing as a case, a deposition, as legal, sealed, and binding testimony, and as a sort of poiesis, as a fiction or an invention, or even, as the literary critic Stephen Greenblatt might say, as a self-invention. Relation as a relación, as writing the matter, as testimony as well as fiction. Relación, relation as a discursive mode shaping and regulating the relation between two sorts of life and two sorts of truth claims about life, each made as or in the form of a relation. This is not the semantic range that we first think of in English when the word relation crops up, but it bears importantly on the concept's political value. If we discard even the weak aristocracies of populus, demos, multitude, deplorables, and so on, then the multitude of relations threatens to become chaotic, anarchic. Here, in the face of this kind of chaos, the secondary residual sense of relation supplements the first, an amphibious term unsettled between forms of life and truth claims, and which remits to the discursive, the imaginary, and even more to the temporal frame of the term relation. This should serve to shape and regulate the field of politics, to shape the notion of the concept, and also to shape the relation between politics and concepts. Now, it's not clear to me that even the second sense of relation, as relación or speaking discursive mode, the amphibian imaginary discursive temporal sense of the term that helped to shape and regulate our chaotically anti-aristocratic multiplicity of relations, it's not clear to me that this will be sufficient to make relation a basic political concept. We'll need something more if we're to set aside a classic conception of individual needs, interests, rights, and responsibilities, and a classic conception of community or a society or any aggregate or class composed of individuals who share needs, interests, rights, and/or responsibilities. We'll need something still more than relation and narration, relation, and narration, to think through a politics that stands on an ontology of a multiplicity of relations. We'll need to return to the term I used as a stand-in for Balibar's series of cognates for multiplicity of relations, the series Transitions, Transferences, and Passages, in which the bonds of individuals to the community is formed and dissolved, and which in its turn constitutes them. The term I offered as a metonym for this series was the term translation. So let me close by returning to Etienne Balibar's work. One of the things that changes in his treatment of relation in the sixth thesis of Feuerbach is his account of the Fremdwort ensemble that Marx uses to indicate the way that relations are to be grouped together. In 1993, Balibar remarks quickly that it is significant that Marx, who spoke French almost as well as German, is here seeking this word, ce mot étranger, ensemble, manifestly in order to avoid the emphasis of das Ganze, the totality or the everything, le tout ou la totalité. The insight bears on the negative. Marx wishes to avoid the implication of totality, of closure and completeness that seems inseparable from das Ganze. The argument on this point is stronger and much more extended in 2014. I won't review it in full, but among the things that the 20-year period has added to La Philosophie de Marx is the consideration of the positive elements that Marx's choice of the Fremdwort ensemble brings to the sixth thesis, and this observation regarding the effects of these positive elements. When the word ensemble steps in where philosophically we expect das Ganze, Balibar writes, a performative effect of detotalization is produced, deconstructing the totality effect or signaling that the new category of being or essence only works as a detotalized totality, which is to say as a totality that detotalizes itself. I'd like to remark here something that seems to me quite specific to the conjuncture, to the moment of enunciation, we might say, of the 2014 complément. Consider, first of all, the articulation of the word, the practice, the program of deconstruction with translation. It's only after and in the context of the great project of the Vocabulaire Européen de Philosophie that this articulation takes shape, and that project takes shape in two informing contexts. First, the politico-economic conjuncture in which globalization and translation, even translatability, seem to go in hand, both inasmuch as natural language translation is the instrument for globalization, and inasmuch as the economics of globalization depends upon the notion that the value of commodities is translatable across markets. Between these two sets of translations' relation to globalization, we draw a system of mutual grounding whose closure seems irreducible. Each is cause and determinate effect of the other. Here, translation can only have the performative effect of detotalization or of deconstructing the totality effect of the logic of global capital if translation retains and affirms its relation to an axiom of untranslatability that weakens the notion of effect, both the performative effect and the totality effect. And here, weakens means renders indeterminate or over and underdeterminate. Deconstruction as translation renders indeterminate or over and underdeterminate the reflexive relation between natural language translation and the value of commodities. Secondly, the functional primacy of detotalization in the articulation of deconstruction with translation doesn't occur in a vacuum in the abstract. It occurs just where the closure and the totality of one system of institutions is being debated most urgently between 1993 and 2014 or so. on the frontiers of Europe as the European Union struggles with increasing difficulty to understand the nature of its frontiers and to enforce different principles of closure, coherence, identity, and continuity, as the United States is doing at the moment. It is in the context of Europe's deployment of the political and economic principle of translatability amongst national languages and national markets that the corresponding critical positive deconstructive effects of translation can be envisioned. Where Europe wants to establish, through the paradigm, the principle or the fantasy of translatability, the commonality or incompatibility of the individuals that it aggregates, there, just there, the critical articulation of deconstruction with translation can produce counter-institutional effects or institutions structured about and founded on different sorts of principles and on a different understanding of the concept of principle than obtained within the closure of the circuit, tying the value of translation to the translatability of value. The stress we find, then, in this recent essay on the deconstruction in the mode of translation of totality effects seems to me to signal a very careful engagement with Derrida's later work, and in particular with what Balibar calls l'effet en retour de l'écriture sur la parole elle-même. The effet en retour is the bounce back effect, what would you say? The feedback effect, yeah, of writing upon parole itself. It also opens a way of approaching the production of political institutions, moving toward political anthropology. If classic political institutions rest conceptually on principles of thought, principles of identity, continuity, contemporaneity, sufficiency, and non-contradiction that are tied to the production of totality effects, then the translation deconstruction of these principles of thought entailed by the primacy of relations may produce the foundations for something else, a materialism of principles. Whatever political institutions can be built upon these principles will be other than self-identical, other than continuous, other than contemporaneous, other than non-contradictory. That institutions exist will not provide immediately a sufficient reason for their existing. Institutions and forms of association based in relationality, in a materialism of principle, will be weakly reversible, that is to say, translatable and untranslatable. They will be formal, that is to say, transitive, and they will be ephemeral, that is to say, deliberately contingent. Thank you.
Close enough, yeah? My concept is trope, and my paper falls into 3 sections. The second is called tropology. The third is called Balibar-isms, with a gratitude to Bruce Robbins. And the first is called conjunctures. Times change. We've known this for a long time, and we've given quite a lot of thought to how changing times impact various modes of intellectual work. Writing in 1995 in an essay in Yale French Studies entitled The Infinite Contradiction, Etienne Balibar observed, philosophy is never independent of specific conjunctures. It should be clear that I use this word in a qualitative rather than a quantitative sense, stressing by it the very brief or prolonged event of a crisis, a transition, a suspense, a bifurcation, which manifests itself by irreversibility, i.e., in the impossibility of acting and thinking as before, unquote. Of the many interesting terms proffered in this passage, I am at the moment most compelled by irreversibility. There is no doubt in part because the irreversible is a trope, or an anti-trope, announcing the impossibility of a return, to which Americans are particularly allergic. There is a hegemonic strain of ideological production in the US for which the irreversible defines that which is not to be named. My own vulnerability to this ideological operation has manifested itself in recent weeks in the form of political rescue fantasies that intrude on me when I'm not engaged by any specific task or conversation, when I walk across the campus, for example. I suspect that I am not alone in my susceptibility to this mode of distraction. But the irreversible in Balibar's formulation here first attracted my attention because of its resonance with the reversal that marks the epigram I had chosen for my talk, a single sentence that accosted me entirely out of context some weeks ago as I read a book review. The epigram had been heedlessly torn from Paul Auster's 1982 The Invention of Solitude. It reads, quote, "Better, of course, meant worse." Better, of course, meant worse calls to me as the appropriate trope for my paper on trope because it captures that aspect of the tropological that is in some respects most appealing to me and at the same time most disturbing to certain, though of course not all, philosophical discourses. This appealing aspect is the capacity of the trope to say A is not A. The figure is antifrusis. That is, the use of a word in a sense opposite to its normal one, especially for ironic effect. Antifrusis reminds us that the tropes signify not only by various approximate, fictional, partial, distorting, manipulative, or dubious analogies, slippages, and half-truths, but also by absolute, if not infinite, contradiction, by misnaming, impropriety, reversal, and abuse. That is to say, tropes signify by calling Juliet the sun. Better, of course, meant worse instances the trope at its limit, but also the trope as essentially the improper, an offense or reversal, or offensive reversal. The OED tells us that the meaning of trope in rhetoric is a figure of speech which consists in the use of a word or phrase in a sense other than that which is proper to it. There are many avatars of this impropriety, including metaphor, catachresis, paradox, aporia, antithesis, oxymoron. Better, of course, meant worse captures the multitude of antiphrastic possibilities in an unapologetic way. Better, of course, meant worse also prompts us to ask what it means to privilege or embrace critical possibilities compressed and represented by this assertion. Reversibility. This is on. It's working. Okay. I can't read my paper. Okay. Better, of course, meant worse also prompts us to ask what it means to privilege the critical possibilities compressed and represented by this assertion, to weigh the import of that carefully placed of course. This suited my purposes very well. So I was very pleased with this figure, which fell into my lap. And then times changed. Better, of course, meant worse acquires another resonance after November 8th, or to be more exact, just before dawn on the morning of November 9th. The new situation is embodied in a conjuncture marked by fake news, post-truths, and a shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue candidate loyalty test, to limit myself for the moment to the meta-language of political discourse. When I contentedly placed this phrase on the opening page of my talk, better, of course, meant worse was my trope for the limit operation of the trope, a moment of exasperated yet comic reversal. It has since acquired a grimmer tonality, perhaps irreversibly. The conjuncture as event and transition entails the everyday. We are always in some conjuncture, and the conjuncture goes all the way down. It is multi-layered, specific, intensely contradictory, and a moving target. It does not so much reveal itself to us, rising into visibility even as it uncannily casts fresh light on new realities, as stumble or tumble across the apparent path, perhaps in a blocking motion, perhaps only impeding and complicating our movement, or perhaps, as Balibar has written of Descartes' work, setting the terms by which the very questions that it fails to thematize, much less answer, are nevertheless disclosed and thus made workable, by which he means available for work, though not to any guaranteed end. The conjuncture manifests itself, as Balibar observes, and must also be made manifest, which is the work of politics and of philosophy and of tropes. Before turning to tropology, let me account insofar as I can for its conjunctural emergence as a topos for me. When I somewhat precipitously selected trope as my concept, I imagined the immediate conjuncture in the following admittedly local terms. First, in relation to the project of political concepts and an earlier symposium, which I will return to in a moment. Then to the debate in my discipline and elsewhere that goes by the rubric of post-critique, including the political component of that debate, which is always present but not to be immediately collapsed into a broader political scene. And finally, most critically, in relation to Etienne Balibar's corpus. These three registers are entwined. In the field of the political concepts project, I had been brooding a bit on a fault line that may exist between the philosophical or political theoretical and the rhetorical or literary theoretical strands at work in the lexicon. And also brooding on the possibility that in recent years, we have been more beholden to the political theoretical. I stress mold and possibility here, just an intimation, but one supplied with its own trope, which motivated my reference above to the rising Juliet. In 2013, at the end of the day conference discussion, a colleague remarked almost in passing that when Shakespeare wrote, Juliet is the sun, he meant Juliet is like the sun, resembles it, shares its sunny qualities. I responded that I thought it crucial that Shakespeare rejects simile. Juliet is like the sun, for metaphor. Juliet is the sun. And that to take the pressure of that phrase, we must take the figure literally. Juliet, of course, meant sun. This formulation will strike some of us as essential, if rather obvious, and others as nonsensical or gnomic or even mystifying. And in between lies the fault line that recommended the concept of trope to me. In reading better, of course, meant worse as trope for trope, I focus on the better and the worse. But the of course is not a trivial interpolation. For some readers, tropes, of course, work the reversal by which better means worse, and such reversals are integral to both conceptualization and to politics, to figuring the conjuncture. For other readers, the of course is not only very much in doubt, not at all that which goes without saying, but a symptom of a problematic theoretical and political position, one that we have finally emerged from after far too long a period of mystification and misdirection. This brings me to the agglomeration of arguments clustered under the name the critique of critique. This complex, internally contradictory formation can't be detailed here today, but it includes work done under various rubrics: new materialism, surface reading, flat ontologies, affect theory. Given its heterogeneity, I can only speak of tendencies that it harbors, and for the moment, my focus is not on its strengths. The three elements that most trouble me are, first, the imperative to claim modesty as a posture for reading, a claim that amounts, I think, to a disavowal and obscures a will to power. Second, the palpable celebration with which discourse, which is a rather all-purpose term in some of this work, is abandoned and parodied as a scourge that forecloses attention to lived material bodies and evolving corporeal practices, as one practitioner puts it. And finally, a political calculation, whereby scholars are both cautioned to relinquish heroic fantasies of our political impact and warned that critique has long since run out of steam anyway. I think these three particular critical gestures often entail a thin and misbegotten analysis of the theoretical problematics characterizing critique and the post-structuralist and structuralist work lumped together with it. But that is an argument I cannot press today. What I will say is that the critique of critique dismisses the trope out of hand, tropes being perhaps the most decadent form of the dreaded discourse. How does critical work that both is and hopes to think a politics engage the unavoidable action of the trope? How does the trope contribute to a politically astute and productive analysis rather than drag us toward impotent, self-important critiquiness? We find multiple answers in Balibar's corpus, where the concept and the question of the trope unfold. In their invitation to potential contributors to today's conference, Adi, Tim, and Bonnie wrote, "You're invited to focus on one of the concepts about which Balibar wrote extensively. For example, class, emancipation, the political, égale liberté, civility, extreme violence, or exploitation. But you are also welcome to try to do other things, to reflect about Balibar's modes of working with concepts, reconstructing, historicizing, or inventing them, to introduce a trope that is conspicuously missing or undeveloped in his work, or to present a concept that you have developed in the course of some dialogue with this or that phase in Balibar's work. The trope runs the table on these alternatives. Balibar's inscription of the trope undermines the distinction between a concept that appears extensively in one's work and one that is conspicuously missing or underdeveloped there. The opposition of present to absent gives way to the work of antithesis and reversal that defines the operation of the trope as an improper name. Tropology. What is a trope? Two obstacles dogged my writing: how to define trope and how to delimit Balibar's text. These questions are a matter of extension: how even to acknowledge the permutations of the concept of the trope, or of Balibar's instantiations of it over his large oeuvre. Amplitude being foreclosed, I have chosen to open these questions. Avoiding proper names, I won't bind the definition of trope to any of the theorists whose work has brilliantly illuminated it. And rather than bring a privileged conception of the trope to bear on Balibar's texts, I traced the emergence of his concept to think the dissemination of the trope. So, what is the trope? I propose 4 terse, incongruent responses: the trope in common sense, the trope in modern philosophy, TV tropes, and trope as the figure of writing itself. I hope not only to pluralize, but to activate meanings of trope perhaps already present in our company. This attempt will be partially successful at best. Even Quintilian crisply defined the trope as, quote, a shift of a word or a phrase from its proper meaning to another in a way that has positive value. But then immediately conceded, quote, an endless battle has raged around this, both by the grammarians among themselves and by the philosophers, as to the genera, species, number, and classification of tropes. He seemingly sidesteps this fight, insisting, I shall disregard subtleties which have no bearing on the training of the orator and discuss only tropes which are most necessary and most widely used, and then wades right in, stipulating his opponent's errors. That the substitution of the proper for the improper remains the subject of endless, subtle battles should perhaps not surprise us. So first, tropes in our common sense. The New York Times crossword puzzle on November 9th, which I fell upon desperately, crossword puzzle being a trope for escape. This puzzle tells us by means of clue 23 down that a trope is, quote, a literary figure of speech. This vernacular definition is useful for more than completing the puzzle, provided we stipulate that this literary invades all language use and the semiotic per se. That the clue qualifies figure by literary suggests that the New York Times regards this stipulation suspiciously. The common sense of trope often seeks to confine it to the literary. But trope has an uncommon philosophical sense, which I discovered in the Dictionary of Untranslatables. I opened the dictionary unprepared to learn that, quote, in modern philosophical usage, the word trope has a completely different meaning, unrelated to previous ones, including the sense of rhetorical figure. It designates a specific instance of a property or relation. Trope has become generally understood in contemporary Anglo-Saxon philosophy as the equivalent of the expression abstract particular. In English, trope is synonymous with what we call concrete properties, unquote. Alain de Libera, who authored this entry, laments this development, writing that this, quote, initiative is clearly unfortunate and all the more inexplicable in that the word trope in English, just as in French, refers to a figure of speech. But today it would be impossible to go against this usage given the currency of the expression in the philosophical literature, unquote. My first thought on reading this was that this unfortunate initiative seems highly improper, while my second reconsidered, given that this misuse confirms the logic of the trope in its rhetorical sense. Whatever its proper technical sense in a particular philosophical idiom, the concept of the trope as a property occurring at a particular time and place resonates with the impossibility of the literally proper, and so with the impropriety of the rhetorical trope. Neologism is catachresis in an extra-literary context. Does the trope's incapacity to give a properly abstract or universal name to its object instantiate the unavoidable specificity of the conjuncture as an abstract particular? TV tropes. TV tropes overturns this emphasis on the conjunctural particular entirely. It is a website, one that glosses trope in terms almost entirely opposed to my suggestions about the concept thus far. Its homepage reads, "Welcome to TV Tropes, the all-devouring pop culture wiki." Merriam-Webster defines trope as a figure of speech, but for creative writer types, tropes are more about conveying a concept to the audience without needing to spell out all the details. The wiki, this is still the homepage, this wiki is called TV Tropes because TV is where we started. But over the course of a few years, our scope has crept out to include other media. Tropes transcend television. They reflect life. Since a lot of art, especially the popular arts, does its best to reflect life, tropes are likely to show up everywhere, unquote. The trope as shortcut or cliché rather than improper or productive reading. The trope is reflecting life rather than signifying it. The easy distinction between the popular and the not in art. These are not readings to which I am sympathetic. And yet TV tropes also insist that a trope is not just linguistic. Images trope, experience tropes, the conjuncture tropes. The sign, omnipresent on this view, even in or as lived material bodies, tropes. This is an essential insight for any politics of tropes. Finally, trope as writing. This last concept of trope leads us directly to Balibar. Writing understood as a productive, that is, a signifying rather than a representational or mimetic practice, is tropological insofar as all language is not merely liable to antiphrosis, but condemned to catachresis, the improper use of a trope for which there is no literal or proper alternative. The arms of the chair and the legs of the table are catachreses. Catachresis, defined as the abuse or perversion of a trope, indicates the original abuse of language, where both the concept and the metaphor are wrested from their proper meaning, and the improper weighs on writing to core. Which takes us to Balibarisms, with, again, thanks to Bruce for his wonderful piece, Balibarism. Balibar problematizes the question of what it is to write and read by means of the trope, which has multiple avatars in his corpus. My disciplinary impulse and the richest way to proceed would be for us to read them together, to the letter and out loud. But in lieu of that more patient approach, I will propose 3 modes of appearance of Balibar's tropes, invoking textual instances that we may consider further in our discussion. First, Balibar in his work consistently foregrounds the language, that is, the natural language of philosophy. Hence his emphases on philosophy as writing and on idiom, translation, and neologism. The brilliant intervention of identity and difference, John Locke and the Invention of Consciousness, dramatizes this, as Balibar argues that, quote, "We can only be struck by the way in which the incompatibility of the problematic of consciousness was thus materialized through the untranslatability of words at the very moment theoretical interests had never been closer," unquote. But under this rubric, we can also place his portmanteau word, égalité, to which he tells us he stubbornly clings, or the recent Althusser's dramaturgy, which begins, quote, "How should we explain that in certain languages at least, notably English, Italian, and Spanish, a renewed interest is taking place in Althusser?" Or the passages from Structuralism, A Destitution of the Subject, where Balibar contends that structuralism's account of the question of the subject has features that are, quote, "if not dependent upon, at least facilitated and suggested by the idiomatic properties of French. Not untranslatable, they nonetheless require a labor of translation, inscribed in the materiality of language," unquote. So the first, Balibarism, writing, neologism, translation. Secondly, Balibar meticulously attends to the tropes of his texts and in his own analyses, pointing to the metaphors of incipient concepts, the figures of the epistemological break, the aporias, paradoxes, oxymorons, antinomies, and antitheses that seem to mark all of the philosophical works he studies. These examples are so numerous that I entrust them to your recollection and only note that these tropes imply their concept. Finally, Balibar's trope of reversal leads him again and again to tease out the antithetical movement of the concept metaphor as a necessary philosophical trajectory. in his own work and in the history of philosophy. On this account, philosophy, or perhaps better to say conceptualization as such, works by unstinting antithesis. Unraveling unity and univocality, it offers an improper name, which in time it will displace, a process that Balibar tropes as the verb to incomplete in the active form. We will find structuralism is thus disclosed as, quote, a movement of both entrance into and exit from the labyrinths of structure, pursuing, quote, the simultaneous operation of deconstruction and reconstruction of subjectivity as an effect, unquote. Indeed, Balibar says every book is undertaken in order to overcome the aporias of the previous one, unquote. An uneven process exemplified in Althusser's Object, where he tracks the figuration of the epistemological break as, quote, the unceasing displacement of an object of thought, which quickly reveals itself to be irreducible to the theses in which it was initially presented, unquote. Indeed, the tropes of reversal proliferate across his analyses. The truly philosophical transformation of matter is paradoxical, he tells us, since in a sense it must be a non-transformation, or a transformation that returns things to where they stood. Structuralism, quote, presents itself as a practice of immanent externality. Indeed, the immanence of philosophy, quote, its practice in a closed space. It is an interiority that is itself immediately absolute exteriority, unquote. Finally, Althusser's view of theory itself becomes one in which, quote, it should not only act upon ideology, that is to say, ultimately upon consciousness, but in order to do so, it must make itself into ideology, transform itself into its opposite, unquote. Incompletion tropes the condition of all writing and reading, and as Balibar writes, quote, philosophy constantly endeavors to untie and retie from inside the knot between the conjuncture and writing, for better or worse. You may not have found my claim that in Balibar's work we see the concept of the trope at work persuasive. This is not impossible, as he remarks in another context. Your demurral would render my argument a catachresis, an abusive trope with no adequate referent in his texts. Balibar has written that, quote, it remains the case that the idea of an anonymous or pseudonymous concept is difficult to assume. If Descartes elaborated a doctrine of consciousness and its foundational character without giving it a name, or by giving it another name, how would we know it, unquote. But he also warns us against taking any philosopher's advice on how to read his text. Returning the last time to the infinite contradiction, we read, quote, not only do philosophers always write within a conjuncture, but conversely, within the conjuncture, they write. They think, no doubt, how could they not? But only through writing and in constant confrontations with the problems writing poses for them. All philosophy is essentially written, and philosophers have a particular relation to writing that necessarily includes all of its forms, technical modes or genres or styles. A singular experience of thought is always an experience of writing. Philosophical practice is one that seeks in and by means of writing to go back to the very constraints the latter imposes on thought, unquote. Forms, modes, genres, styles. Balibar adds tropes to this list immediately thereafter when he names the first constraining modality he encounters in his own work, aporia. Aporia powers incompleting of the self and the incompleting of others. Balibar writes, if it is true that the regulating idea of system is fundamentally a modern version of the old imago mundi, the meaning of all these aphoretic undertakings is, if not to transform, probably to incomplete the world, or the representation of the world as a world, unquote. To incomplete the representation of the world as a world in the present conjuncture seems risky. But if the conjuncture is not unintelligible, but nonetheless fundamentally unmasterable, as Balibar also tells us, it appears there can be no advantage in playing for time. If the irreversible can be reformed, to borrow a key word from Bruce Robbins' essay, it requires the work of tropes. The name by itself produces an effect, Balibar writes of Locke. For the irreversible to become the object of demonstration, argument, struggle, signification, or affect, it must be turned. The reversible can only emerge from the irreversible, from its incompleting, through the material work of an unanticipatable trope that cannot but lack for proper guarantees. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those wonderful papers. We will now have time for questions and discussion up till about 11:10. So just open the floor, but do signal to me if you would like to ask a question, and I'll put you on the list, and I'll also try to routinely look around the entire room, so don't hesitate to signal me. Okay, I've got Bruce Robbins. Anyone else? Okay, Bernard.
Am I at the right distance? Yeah. Let me see if I can see my notes. So this is for you, Ellen. You know that you and I agree about the critique of critique. I think passionately so. So it's in that spirit that I ask, when I heard you say something like, theory, in order to be effective, must make itself into ideology, not just critique ideology, I found myself wondering whether, if I agree with that, which I think I do, whether this might not be our version, our area of agreement with those people that we otherwise disagree with. You see what I mean?
Yes. That line was Balibar glossing Althusser, and it did have it had some conditions placed upon it, as in theory must turn itself into ideology, but not into a religious lecture and a couple of other, which for the sake of time I left out. So that's just a parenthesis. I think I'm not entirely sure who the folks in the critique of critique agglomeration you're thinking of, maybe the affect theory people. I invoked that line mainly for that amazing reversal of theory becoming ideology, but if I were to expand upon it in the light of other things that I said, I would say that ideology there means figure rather than figure of solidarity rather than data or fact. So a component of the discourse that is not, that makes, in fact, facts appear as facts rather than more facts, as a way of bringing your interlocutor onto your terrain so that you can then speak about facts and truth and policy. Does that?
Bernard?
Thank you both. So I wanted to ask a question that goes to both presentations, because it's going to ask a question about the relation between trope and critique. So I wasn't sure, Ellen, from your presentation, if the rejection of tropes as a technique in the critique of critique is something substantively philosophical about how trope operates, or rather whether it's kind of more of an objection to something that one would say is effective about kind of the cleverness of tropes. So the question really is whether you think that from the kind of critique of critique perspective, whether there's a theoretical objection to the way that tropes are used, or whether it's more that it's just like, you know, these people are too clever and objectionable in that way. And then to Jacques, I'm not sure I heard enough, but maybe I missed it, but I'm not sure I heard enough about relations of power. And of course, that would also then relate to trope and the critique of critique. And so the question there, I take it, is whether relations of power today in the formulation of concepts or in what we do is participating in possibly whatever it is, the relationship between trope and critique that was coming out in Ellen's talk. And of course, and those relations of power then would also relate to the most recent political events. Thanks.
I certainly think that that irritation, the too clever by half, affect is at work in some of the articulations of the critique of critique. It's definitely present. I teach an intro course in monoculture media, and I say that on the very first day of class, of course, every single one of you in this room should take the class. But I do, in fact, think that there is such a thing as an intellectual temperament, and there is an intellectual temperament which reads a page, and it's difficult and aggravating, and the desire is to throw the book against the wall. And there is an intellectual temperament in which, when the writing is annoying and challenging, that you want to read it 3 more times because that is your pleasure, and that those two intellectual temperaments are not morally distinct from one another, but that my class is very hard for people who have a throw the book against the wall impulse when the material is unfamiliar and challenging, and that you need to think about that. A class is a terrible thing to waste. And I think that kind of, this is all just, although the irritation with the cleverness is also an assertion that this is trivial. It's clever and to no productive end, which means that for me it is then wrapped up in what it is intended as a substantive critique. The people under this gross rubric that I am using are so heterogeneous that what I'm about to say now certainly does not apply to all of them, but some of them really have an absolutely straightforward account in which talking about discourse is a waste of time. It has led us into the dark forest, and thank heavens now, pounding on the table, we can talk about tables and real bodies and death, real death, not that figure of death in deconstruction. And I think that critique is, I'm sure it's coming across, not well-founded, but it is present, and the people who are pursuing it are not just irritated. They do think that there can be a shift in, or has been a shift in the problematic that is away from, you can call it language, writing, the trope. They tend to call it discourse and blur all those things together. But
so very quickly, so then it would be that, like, meaning is what it means. So it is a rejection of the trope in the sense that it's,
I think,
better did mean better. Right?
go ahead. Please, go ahead.
No, it can't be that, because of what you were suggesting about literalization. Like when we read a metaphorical identification, Juliet is the sun, that's a literalization. At that moment, you're pressing the point that it's a literalization. And that there's a choice not to use analogy.
Yes.
Right? So for instance, when I'm teaching Kafka, sometimes he'll use a simile and sometimes he will not. He will make a clear metaphorical association. And it's very interesting to see when and where the simile works and where literalization works. But literalization can be a way of saying he means what he means. In other words, you can't make it interchangeable with another kind of trope. A metaphor is not a simile, and it matters, right? So it can't quite be that.
Relations of power. I think one of the dangers of focusing on that is the danger of granting power a more literal standing than it should have, it seems to me. This isn't to say that concepts like relation aren't the effect of the exercise of power at certain moments, under certain conditions, institutional, social, etc. We don't, concepts are produced like widgets and iPads as well. And for that reason, there's always a circuit of power in the production of a concept. But to make that circuit of power that is entailed in the production of the concept, the literal cause of it, or the ultimate ground for that concept, seems to me to be a worrisome problem, and to dehistoricize in a funny way the way in which concepts are produced and put into circulation and used at certain moments as well. That is to re-idealize concepts by means of the deployment of the concept of power as the basis for the production of concepts. In the current conjuncture, however, I think that it's strategically absolutely critical to use the concept of power and to remit naturalized concepts back to the place where power is exercised to produce them and to institutionalize them. Without that maneuver, it seems to me, we don't have, Jay and I were talking about what it means to resist now in the context of the November election. And one of the things it must mean, surely, is that process of translating back a naturalized concept or a classic concept into the scene of its inscription by means of different relations of power. That is, to show how something like America is the product of relations of power distributed unevenly and set into work unevenly at a particular moment for different purposes of gain and the accumulation of power. So that would be, it seems to me, a direct pedagogical / political intervention that one would want to make following, I think, what you're saying. And I think that goes to the question of critique. This would be another way of imagining the role of critique at the moment. But I think that one has to balance that role that one would want to give critique as the procedure of remitting the naturalized concept to the scene of its inscription by means of relations of power, by trying to avoid the renaturalization of power as the basic concept on which we would then proceed, if you see what I mean.
Jay is next.
Thank you both. I have a question for each. I'll begin with Jacques, since it really picks up from Bernard's question. You said, I think deeply plausibly, that for Balibar, relation is first ontology. And that seems to me, I'm sorry, relation is first ontology. And that does seem to me an important driving thought. And then you rightly said at that very moment that the first marker of that thought is the notion of trans-individuality, and that the notion of relation in conjunction with trans-individuality means that aristocracies will always be upset. And I think that's a great thought, but just as said, completely false, which was, I think, the point of Bernard's question, that there's nothing wrong with a relation of power of dominance as a structural to a relation. So it takes another step to ask why trans-individuality, as intended by Balibar, should have this dynamic of equalization, if it does, and if it doesn't, right, then what other things are necessary, right? One may ask, do you need politics as first philosophy to be necessary? Do you need material a priori truth of equilibrity? So it doesn't seem to me relationality and transindividuality without all that other stuff is going to do the work. So that's my question there. Ellen, wow. It seems to me you raised a great question and then you ran away from it at 1,000,000 miles an hour. So the question goes something like this, and you ended beautifully with that thought of aporia as the continual upset of system, right? And reversing what claims to be irreversible. But you started the paper by saying our new reality is post-truth. That our new reality is therefore always already aporetic. That is, the aporia cannot be an intervention in a reality in which the notion of irreversible is itself obliterated as a term, that we live in the thought of permanent reversibility. I mean, I do think this politics of the present changes those structures. That it's very nice to have a consolidated, hierarchical, closed, systematic totality you can deconstruct and, and all that. But what happens when the fundamental structure of power is to keep moving, to make sure that it is decentered always, that there is no place you can locate it, that it is already troping itself, that there's nothing literal it claims. And it seems to me that's the way you open the paper. And then it seemed to me that you return to the traditional problem by offering, right, the critique of the critique people, which seems right, but seems far away from where we are. Now, maybe I misunderstood, but that was sort of my puzzle.
These are actually related questions, it seems to me.
Of
Yeah.
course they are. I only have one thought.
Yeah.
Just clear that out.
I was particularly pleased with my little sentence about the aristocracy and the anti-aristocracy of ontologies of relations. Yeah. But part of what I meant by that had to do with the tendency through the concept of the aristeia or of the aristocracy, of that procedure of self-naturalization and the installing of a particular relation in the field of relations as the governing or explaining term for the totality of those. There's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, that's a necessary aspect of conceptualization, it seems to me, and of thinking. What the problem arises at the moment when the grounds on which the governing relation at a certain moment are established themselves seem to be unsusceptible of critique and eternal, like an aristocracy. That's at the point at which this additional process, which you would call a dynamic, for example, of democratization, would intervene. Whether that dynamic is intrinsic to a system of relations or something that we bring as a political action or as a political subjectivity seems to be a really difficult question. What I was suggesting was that that dynamic of aristocratizing, of incompleting, to use Etienne's word, is also internal to the system of relations. And that when we, as political agents, latch onto that, we are acting with the system of relations. Okay. You don't agree with that last step, but that's okay.
Please, if you want to say, no, it doesn't just have, go ahead.
No, it's just the same question again. It's just why think relationality has to do with following through something in a certain direction rather than another direction. Nothing about relationality itself, right, bears that weight. That's my only thought.
Yes.
Okay. We're agreed.
So when you began by saying I ran a million miles an hour away, I thought that you were referring to the way in which I tried, much more self-consciously than I ordinarily would, to not say a trope is X, but to produce the different ways of maybe saying what a trope is. And then not to say, and here's the moment of the trope in Balibar's work, but here are these figures for it. But given that that wasn't what you were pointing to, I would say that I didn't say our new reality is post-truth. I said our conjuncture is characterized by, and one of the things on the list was post-truths. And that may seem like just a too clever kind of way of trying to make a distinction, but I do think that is an important distinction because our reality is characterized by many other things than the post-truth effect that we saw in the last election. And if you were suggesting that aporia, or the trope, is on the side of the post-truth, then I would say I don't agree with that. I think aporia and all of the other tropes are part of the process by which truth is put into play. And that's true for the political opposition and those of us who were not outvoted but are now will be out of power. So that aporia is, or the trope is an operation always at work in every politics and in every philosophy. So that's the not reversible part of what I was arguing. So how can I be, so I'm committed to that. Well, please.
So again, it's just, so maybe just ask the question in a more bold way. It looks like the traditional notion of critique operates against something that claims to be stable or closed or authoritative or meaningful in itself, right? And my question was, what happens when authority deauthorizes itself in the sense of nothing I say should be taken literally, everything is just for the sake of the effects of now, and we'll see how it plays out. So the question is that the notion of critique seems to me to find it much more difficult to know when the literal, let's call it the literal and metaphorical, are at play, right? We've got a world in which that distinction, right, that's Trump's intention, is to make that distinction idle. He wants that not to operate. And my question is, how does critique, using, I'm not disagreeing with what you argued, how do we intervene when that's the case? That's what I meant.
So the distinction was never, part of what I'm saying is this distinction was never real. So in the past, when people were insisting on that distinction, the figural and the literal were always already one. But to the question of critique, I guess I would say that in the place of what you are perhaps invoking when you say critique, I would put symptomatic reading. And symptomatic reading always attended to that, or maybe there are two different things going on, aren't there? One is that this foregrounding of artifice and the figural. But since its foreground is only a shift in emphasis, that doesn't seem to me to present a problem for symptomatic reading. It always attended both to propositional and conceptual contradictions and claims and the operation of the text, always. But the other thing you're talking about is how fast positions are being abandoned. And that I don't have an answer for. But it seems to me it's a different question. The fact that when you counter a text, let's call it that instead of an argument, that your opponent will invoke another text very immediately rather than stand his or her ground. Isn't that a different kind of question than?
But
That I-
it is.
yeah.
I'm saying that's the way the question's been changed.
Well, then we have to be as quick as, right?
Speed.
Or, well, if speed is the, please, someone had the,
Well, I think that this could be a moment that critical theory decides we don't just critique.
oh, no, of course.
You know, I mean, in the sense that, you know, I mean, I think this is really an interesting exchange. I mean, the comment that people were making, which is a very, very fine one, it seems, in this case, is that voters for Trump took him seriously but not literally, and voters against Trump took him literally and not seriously. And the gap between serious and literal, I think, is extremely interesting, and it's something that makes me, as a critical theorist who thinks I can just work on the level of discourse, nervous, because I can't. Because something else is in that gap that I don't know how to take seriously, because it actually has never been in my purview, and that I consider a problem on the left. In other words, I am a flyover intellectual. That's what I was saying earlier today to somebody. I'm a flyover intellectual. I do not land in Kansas or Iowa, even at the big universities of those places. So I think that's a serious problem that we face. Rather, we have taken a certain ideology of globalization, a very coherent ideology of globalization that connects with neoliberalism, and we have critiqued it because we have shown that it's incoherent and inaccurate. But we're not prepared for this other, which is a discourse that has not had any legitimacy, and so we have not, so it's not an ideology. But I mean, so I think you're doing some really interesting work, and it's fair to run away because, as you say, your escape and rescue, I think, are two very closely related terms, at least for the kind of way that we are with our sensibility dealing with this situation. But so I'm not sure. I mean, I think that our content of just being critical theorists is being challenged at this moment and should be.
But I truly wasn't intending to say we should just be critical theorists.
No, I know you were.
Okay.
Which I thought was really good.
Okay, we have a lot of people on the queue. Adi, then Peter, then Etienne. Start. No, she wasn't.
Oh, okay, but way down the list.
So this is a question to Jacques.
Can't hear you.
This is a question to Jacques. Maybe it's a result of misunderstanding, but you can easily clarify it. What do you do with a phrase like bringing something into relation? To bring into relation, which is crucial for both politics and theory, presuppose that there are elements that are outside the relation, presuppose a relation to the relation, and presuppose productivity, certain productivity, and certain differentiation of in the map of relations of each of the elements. So how does it fit into your description, analysis?
When one says, I'm going to bring something into relation, or bring people into relation, the horizon of that is almost an absolute one, in which you initially would say, well, here's something that has no relation, and I'm going to bring it into relation or into the field of relations. My thinking on this is that that is a fantasy, and it's a very useful political fantasy, but a fantasy because there is no entity that is prior to relations that you would then bring into a field of relations. What there is different tactical sets of relations that you can bring things into, as it were, by an act of force or by an act of the exercise of an act of power, but never from a naked position of a lack of relations. That seems to me to be the fundamentally ideological, in the bad sense of ideology, not in the rather better sense of ideology, maneuver, or a religious maneuver that says from ex nihilo we can bring something into the world of relations. Most or many ideologies, many apparatuses will ground themselves on such a kind of genesic religious notion that you're bringing into relation and into a sphere of relations that that are either built or given. So for the purposes of my kind of argument, you would want to say that part of what is entailed in thinking about an ontology of relations in this specific way is giving yourself the devices by means of which you can unmask or show, this would be the critical maneuver, unmask or show the ways in which that religious myth of importing into a field of relations from outside relations, from the pristine world of pre-relational simple individual being into a field of fallen relations, how that can be shown to be at work in institutions, in political positions, and so on.
I did not say that it's bringing from a vacuum. It's bringing from one set of relations into another. Yeah. So there is always a politics of establishing externality and internality by this move. Right.
I think we may be in agreement, but what I was saying is that the horizon of that politics of bringing from one set of relations into another relations, even if it's only a rhetorical device, is one that says, I'm doing that because this is available for me to bring into this field of relations, because it's unrelated. That is, it doesn't have, it's not attached, so I can bring it, I can import it into my field like this, rather than saying I have to wrench it from an existing set of relations and bring it into this field of relations.
I have a question for Jacques, and I think it's a sort of repetition of a conjunction of two questions already that I think in a way didn't get addressed. So I'm going to ask it again in a cruder way, as is my way. And I'll go like this, I would say, well, if relation is first ontology, then relation is not a political concept, because politics is not a concept of first ontology. It's a concept that's only basic to social ontology. Maybe I leave it simple.
I think that what I was trying to do, and I apologize for the relative quickness of the 75 pages that I read very quickly, was to disagree with the point that politics is not first ontology. That is, I do think that there is an ontological aspect to political commitments that takes the shape of relationality, but relationality only in the sense, or in the strong sense of the paradoxical position of a relationality that precedes the relata in that way.
Okay, I mean, so you want to be a flat ontologist in relation to elements. You are one of those.
Nobody has ever called me a flat ontologist before. No, there's nothing flat about there's nothing flat about what I'm saying. To the contrary, it's a very pockmarked thing, this relation.
If a fat ontologist is an ontologist who is fat, that's me. Okay, I don't want to be too long, and I'm in great danger of imagining that I should always react to whatever is said, starting with me or, okay, but one quick thing on trans-individuality and first ontology, and one remark, if you allow me, on incompleting in the active sense. First, taking everything that Jacques said, not for granted, but for crucial and inspiring. I have to concede, let's put it like that, that not only I did not invent trans-individuality, but even if I tried to make a certain use of it, and therefore, of course, elaborate, or begin to elaborate. But second, and most of all, the idea of relation or relationality as first ontology is certainly not an idea that I could claim to be an original discovery. In a sense, it's just the opposite. I'm belatedly joining, I would say, a very long history of problems, which on the one hand traces back probably as far as Neoplatonism, and in a sense is in nous, but of course I completely agree with you in the most contradictory manner that you carefully discussed, in the very Greek name that is used by Aristotle, and that we translate as relation or relatio, which in fact is not a name, but is prosti, to prosti, the towards something. Okay, so not entering into, and of course this is very much the object of many important contemporary debates brought to the fore by people, some of which are here. So let me say why I see now that there is in this respect, there is a problem with trans-individuality, because with the name and the meaning of that name, because trans-individuality, different from, of course, inter-individuality, etc., referring to an already existing, although of course never stable, both pre-individual and post-individual structure or system of relations, or ensemble of relations. In its very name retains something that is problematic, or in any case cannot be the only possibility, which is symmetry, I would say. Symmetry. It's very hard to escape the idea that if you speak of trans-individuality and you use it in a general manner, perhaps you eliminate the idea that the terms have been already existing and posited, so to speak, before the relation, but you don't eliminate the idea that there is, at least potentially, some sort of reciprocity, a very dangerous or very sensitive notion, or to put it in, you turn to the word that was emphasized by Ellen, of course, some sort of reversibility. Now, a great deal of the contemporary and, in fact, also ancient reflection that leads to considering relation as first ontological category before the substance, etc., is based on exactly the opposite assumption, namely that you need to immediately take into account the disymmetry, the intrinsic disymmetry, and the non-reversibility, or the fact that the reversibility is not granted. And of course, certain others are particularly interesting in this respect. I cannot not mention Spinoza, and that has something to do with Bernard's question, because ultimately Spinoza's definition of power is a capacity to be affected. This is essentially a disymmetric relation, and it's also a way to subvert something in a given notion of power. And Judith, allow me, even if I simplify enormously, and I skip, of course, Lévinas and Blanchot, etc., but then we come to vulnerability as a key notion. So I have to admit that the way in which I formulated things did not exclude that, but also did not take it seriously enough into account. And this is a whole new chapter, I would suggest, of what you proposed that has to be developed, perhaps beginning with the transition, the transference, the translation, because these are not necessarily symmetric processes. And more quickly, if you allow me, incomplete, to incomplete in the active sense. So at some point I had become almost obsessed with that idea, and that arose primarily from the fact that I had, I didn't know exactly why, of course, a kind of fascination for the great philosophical works which are clearly incomplete, which do not reach the end that they announce, and that which leave us in the middle of nowhere, or not of nowhere, but of a swamp. That is Marx's Capital, Spinoza's theological political treatise, and Rousseau's social contract, and so on and so on. Which led me to the crazy idea that the most interesting way to read great books, Sartre's Critique of Dialectical Reason, Heidegger's Sein und Zeit, and so on and so on. So the most interesting way to read great works of philosophy, or perhaps to single out certain works of philosophy among the others, is to find the latent way, or the obscure way in which they are in fact incomplete, or, and I got to that phrase, incompleting their own model, if you like, or in as much as they write themselves. So, but at that point, I wanted to, I had to write a paper for my friend Peter on Foucault's trans-individual, not, excuse me, what's the concept? Transdisciplinarity, yes, another trans. Well, don't say stupidities about trans. And I had written, and I was sincere. I thought this is a great idea I have had. Let's apply it to Foucault. So Foucault is incompleting his own text. And then I discovered that Foucault himself had used this verb in an active form. But the last thing that I want to add to this is a family. This is a family, and here we get to the question of the trope, this is a family, of course, which is not always completely translatable. So we now have deconstruct, Interestingly, of course, Derrida claimed in a hesitant and complicated manner a certain relationship to Heidegger's Destruktion, but of course in the Destruktion, even if it's not the usual German term, etc., you don't hear the construction. And then you have something that is specifically English. I had to, I was unable to find a good equivalent when I needed to translate and publish in my series in French the beautiful collection of essays by my friend Emmanuel Wallerstein, which has the title Unthinking Social Science. To unthink something. And we could continue, you just introduced deothorize and so on. So the risk here, of course, I mean, is that the trope becomes a cliche, to follow your, but on the other hand, we seem to be aware of the fact that something essential, perhaps, in the way critical theorizing or thinking has been practiced on various sides in the last period has to do with that idea of incompleting in an active sense. And therefore, well, okay, I think you did exactly the right thing.
Okay, well, that sounds like a good utterance to end.